Kuat Drive Yards produce some of the most iconic designs ever seen in the Star Wars galaxy. They are the company responsible for the sharp, angular, aggressive design of the Star Destroyers, and their influence has had a dramatic effect on the shape of the galaxy. So in this episode of College of Lore, we are going to dive deep into the history, designs, and impacts of the great KDY. Kuat Drive Yards is a very old company. It was founded sometime just after the formation of the Galactic Republic, thousands of years before the events of the Skywalker saga, on the planet Kuat. Society on Kuat was extremely hierarchical, and possessed a pronounced aristocracy. In fact, even the name of the planet Kuat is actually the name of the most powerful aristocratic family that controls and owns it, the Kuat family. They also own practically everything on the planet, even the common people, who are either indentured servants or serfs, depending on who you ask. The other powerful families of the planet are all subservient to the Kuat family to varying degrees, but they still compete with each other for status via the standard cloak and dagger political games that wealthy noble families love. Shortly after the founding of the Galactic Republic, the 10 wealthiest families of Kuat came together in a bid to vastly increase their own galactic influence. They hired terraformers to turn their planet into a paradise suitable for their villas and mansions, while combining their various shipbuilding firms into one company, Kuat Drive Yards. They then began construction of the most impressive series of orbital dockyards the galaxy had ever seen, eventually giving shape to Kuat's most striking feature, its artificial ring. Their efforts would eventually ensure that Kuat Drive Yards would become one of the galaxy's premier shipbuilders, although that process would take thousands of years. Kuat Drive Yards remained a small but respectable shipbuilder for a very long time after its founding, only achieving large-scale success when one of its competitors, Core Galaxy Systems, collapsed, and KDY acquired all of its assets. This gave the company the leverage it needed to expand rapidly, quickly buying out and absorbing a number of smaller shipbuilders and buying up many resource-rich worlds to expand mining and manufacturing operations. It also created subsidiary companies to hide the company's wealth and disguise some of their more sensitive projects. And by the time of the Clone Wars, KDY had made its way to the top, becoming the most prestigious capital ship manufacturer in the galaxy. While Kuat Drive Yards didn't only build capital ships, it was what they were best known for. KDY ships tended to be very large, heavily armored, and heavily armed. Before the Clone Wars, this represented something of a problem for the company, since the regulations created by the Ruusan Reformation placed heavy restrictions on the armament of large starships, and restricted the speed of ships in proportion to their armament. For KDY, that meant many of their larger ships had to be built with fewer guns than the company would have preferred, and the largest ships had to be built with woefully underpowered hyperdrives, making them useless as anything other than system defense vessels. This was, of course, the point of the Ruusan Reformation regulations, but to KDY it was simply an obstacle. To get around this, KDY had a habit of building their ships with oversized power generators and large empty spaces on the hulls of their vessels where weapons could potentially be placed. This way, they could skirt regulations by adding weapons to ships that were to be used exclusively defensively by removing the hyperdrives before making the additions but after making delivery, thus rendering the ships outside of the regulation framework while still allowing for timely delivery of the ship. It also allowed Kuat Drive Yards the option to rapidly up-arm their vessels in the event of the regulations ever being changed, which did of course happen at the outbreak of the Clone Wars. An event which also happened to wildly increase demand for the type of ship that KDY was most well known for, the Star Destroyer. Kuat Drive Yards is the preeminent builder of Star Destroyers, with their sharp triangular shape optimized for forward firepower, heavy armor, and massive size. They are the pinnacle of Kuwati design, and as the Clone Wars went on, demand for these ships of war grew and grew, growing the influence and power of KDY along with it. Kuat Drive Yards used this increase in power to lobby for bigger and bigger contracts from the Republic Navy, and after the rise of the Empire, they became the #1 military shipmaker in the galaxy by value. Now, let's go over some of the most important ships manufactured by KDY. As the face of the Republic Navy during the Clone Wars, the Venator-class Star Destroyer occupies a special place in the hearts of many. Coming in at 1,137 meters long and costing 59 million credits, this ship might be small by Imperial standards, but it packed a serious punch. Carrying 8 DBY-827 heavy turbo lasers, numerous point defense lasers, and heavy torpedo launchers, the Venator was a venerable warship, but its true strength lied in its hangar bay. The Venator possessed a unique role as a hybrid battleship carrier in the Republic Navy. As such, it also possessed a unique design feature. The spine of the ship could open up via 2 massive dorsal doors, revealing a truly enormous hangar running the length of the ship's main section. This hangar could hold a staggering 420 starfighters in one configuration, and thanks to the massive doors, these fighters could deploy extremely rapidly. This ability gave Republic task forces the ability to overwhelm their opposition with starfighters, allowing bombers to move in for the kill, while the Venators could hang back and engage with long-range turbolaser fire. Of course, the Venator was not exclusively used this way. The Republic Navy did not have many capital ships available to it, so the Venator had to fulfill many roles. In some of these, the ship suffered, as it was not quite heavily armed or armored enough to engage separatist dreadnoughts at close range. However, the ship was more than capable enough to give them a good fight, and with a lucky shot or two, it could even win. Still, after the Clone Wars, the newly formed Galactic Empire did quickly phase the Venator out, in favor of newer, heavier designs, sending most of these venerable ships to the scrapyard. This was partially because Imperial doctrine called for heavier battleships to do most of the fighting, but it was also due to the Venator's other name, the Jedi Cruiser. Since the Clone Wars had been synonymous with Jedi leadership, and the Venator was synonymous with the Clone Wars, the Empire wanted to distance itself from the ship's storied legacy, and preferred vessels that would be associated with the new government, rather than its fallen predecessor. Smaller than the Venator, but with a much longer service life, the Arquitens-class light cruiser was rushed into service at the start of the Clone Wars. Coming in at 325 meters in length and costing only 4 million credits, this light cruiser was primarily used as an escort ship during the Clone Wars, fighting alongside cruisers in large fleet actions to act as fire support or as a screen for enemy ships. They were significantly faster than the Venators and Acclamators they typically fought alongside, and were quite well armed for their size. Each Arquitens came equipped with 4 dual turbo laser turrets, as well as quad laser turrets and missile tubes, giving the light cruiser more than enough firepower to deal with smaller CIS ships, and more than enough range to join the Venators it deployed alongside in firing at distant targets. Like the Venator though, the Arquitens class suffered somewhat at close range. While its laser cannons and missile tubes were more powerful up close, the primary weapons, the turbo lasers, gained little. And while the ship was well armored for a light cruiser, that doesn't change the fact that light cruisers are in fact light, and suffer heavy damage when they attempt to melee with heavier ships. The Arquitens was agile enough to avoid some fire, as long as it was from a distance, but the ship was no corvette. It had to rely on a delicate balance between avoiding heavier fire and absorbing lighter fire in order to avoid destruction. Such is the life of all light cruisers. After the formation of the Empire, most Republic Navy vessels found themselves on the short list for retirement, but interestingly not the Arquitens. Instead, the Empire had a number of the light cruisers refitted and used as command ships for small fleets and flotillas out in the Outer Rim. As it turned out, the Arquitens was perfect for this role, and it continued to serve in this fashion well into the post-Endor period, even being used as the personal command ship of the powerful Moff Gideon. Perhaps the most iconic symbol of Imperial power, the Imperial-class Star Destroyers were quite possibly Kuat Drive Yards' most notable creation. Coming in at 1,600 meters long, and with an estimated price tag of 150 million credits, this wedge-shaped battleship struck fear into the hearts of enemies of the Empire everywhere. In fact, this was actually one of the ship's primary functions, since there was very little more demoralizing to a rebellious populace than the sight of one of these ships hanging over their planet. Imperial Star Destroyers came in several variants, all sharing a basic hull and layout, but with modifications to armor, weaponry, and modules. All variants, though, were armed and armored enough to take on a small fleet, single-handedly, and often did so. ISDs were primarily armed with heavy turbolasers, with the most common variant, the Imperial II, possessing 50 batteries of heavy turbolasers alongside 20 heavy ion cannons and 20 more single-mount heavy turbolasers. This amount of heavy, long-range firepower was more than an entire fleet of 5 Venator Star Destroyers could bring to the table, making a single Imperial II more than capable of leveling any large target it could be expected to go up against, although it was not infallible. Despite bringing a fleet's worth of firepower, the Imperial II almost entirely lacked light and point defense weapons, leaving it incredibly vulnerable to starfighters. It did carry 6 squadrons of TIE fighters in its ventral hangar, which theoretically should provide adequate fighter screening for the battleship, but in practice this often proved not to be the case. The rebel fleets ISDs found themselves facing, more often than not, were based around small, potent snub fighters that were more than capable of shredding the Star Destroyer's screening force and delivering payloads of heavy ordnance to the ship's exposed shield generators and superstructure, occasionally resulting in the loss of the ship. The Imperial II was also not the only variant to suffer from this weakness, with all the ships of the Imperial line suffering from the same problem to varying extents. Still, when deployed alongside escorts or with large screening forces, the Imperial Star Destroyers were unmatched as warships, and, in Legends, continued to be used both by the Imperial Remnant and New Republic decades after their first construction. Fast, nimble, and armed to the teeth, the Raider-class corvette represents KDY's solution to the starfighter problem. Coming in at 150 meters long and with a price tag of about 3 million credits, this agile gunship is perfect for turning rebel snub fighters into space debris. After the Venator line was retired and the Imperial Navy was filled with more and more ISDs, a tactical problem began to emerge. Imperial fleets were more than capable when dealing with large ships, but starfighters were becoming deadly. A single squadron of Y-Wings left over from the Clone Wars was able to make easy work of an Imperial Star Destroyer once its fighter screen was depleted, and newer, more capable fighters and bombers were soon to be on the way. The Imperial Starfighter Corps was working on their answer using Sinar fleet systems, but the Navy wanted their own solution, so they turned to KDY. Kuat's answer was the Raider Corvette, armed with 6 twin heavy laser cannon turrets and numerous light laser and ion cannons, as well as an option for concussion missile launchers. This small escort was perfect for engaging and destroying small squadrons of snub fighters, particularly those pesky bombers the Navy was worried about. On top of that, the Raider was designed to be fully capable of long-range independent patrols in order to extend the Empire's reach into systems nearby their fleet deployments, but just too far out of the way for a full fleet presence. This design feature meant the Raider was also perfect for modification and deployment as support for Imperial Special Forces. Inferno Squad famously used the Raider-class corvette Corvus as a mobile base of operations during their tenure. The ship was modified to add a small hangar, but was otherwise fairly standard for a Raider-class corvette. The fact that such a modification was possible on such a small ship should not be glossed over, though. Hangars are large, and require significant structural alterations. The fact that the Corvus was able to function so well after those alterations were made, and still be able to perform its duties as a corvette, is incredibly impressive, and quality like that is exactly why KDY stays on top. To get on top, though, Kuat Drive Yards had to make a name for itself, and they did it using this, the Mandator-class Dreadnought. Coming in at 8,000 meters long and with a cost in the 500 million credit range, this behemoth was the ultimate in system defense at the time of its creation. Though hilariously underarmed thanks to the limitations of the Ruusan Reformation, and with a hyperdrive that was just about capable of making it from Kuat to the core in a couple of months, the Mandator was not exactly a brilliant warship, but that wasn't the point. At the time of its creation, decades before the Clone Wars, there was no need for a large mobile navy anywhere in the galaxy, except perhaps in the Trade Federation, and they weren't exactly on good terms with KDY. There was, however, a need for system defense vessels. The Mandator was almost certainly overkill as a system defense vessel, being theoretically capable of taking on up to 1,000 Commerce Guild destroyers at once, but that was not the real strength of the Mandator line. What the Dreadnought really did was serve as a status symbol, as well as proof positive that if you want a big capital ship, you come to Kuat. At the time of the Clone Wars, only 7 Mandator-class dreadnoughts were in service, 3 of which were in Kuat itself, so the class didn't exactly see widespread proliferation, but that was okay. Each Mandator served as the anchor for a massive defense fleet, with the 4 outside of the Kuat system going to some of the wealthiest and most prestigious of core worlds. And with each ship sold, the prestige of Kuat grew more and more. The Mandator was never really a warship. After all, the 3 protecting Kuat were theoretically capable of destroying a fleet of thousands, far more than Kuat would ever need. But what they said about the power of those who fielded them was just as important. The Mandator was a statement, and it came through loud and clear. With the prestige gained by the Mandator class alongside its reputation for secrecy, KDY became the clear choice for the secret creation of the Republic Navy during the build-up to the Clone Wars. And with that contract, KDY cemented itself as the best warship manufacturer in the galaxy, just in time for the formation of the Empire. As the Clone Wars came to a close and the galaxy began to shift, more and more focus began to be put on anti-insurgency operations. The Empire needed escorts for supply ships, the corporate sector needed patrol ships, and local governments everywhere needed anti-piracy vessels. To answer this growing need, Kuat Drive Yards created the EF-76 Nebulon B escort frigate, a cheap, efficient ship to deal with the insurgents. Coming in at 300 meters long and costing only 9 million credits, the Nebulon B was a sleek, minimalist design that was the opposite of what KDY normally specialized in. The bulbous structure and separate drive section looked nothing like the prime line of Star Destroyers that Kuat is known for. But that was somewhat the point. Normally, Kuat Drive Yards designed their ships to look angular and intimidating, in hopes that the ship's enemies would be demoralized simply by being in its presence. Those were warships, though, and striking fear into the hearts of all who see them is a great trait for a warship to have, but it is not a good trait for a civilian escort ship. The Nebulon B's primary duty was to escort civilian trade and protect against raiders and pirates. Thus, it was designed in a way that made it look almost like a civilian ship itself. That way, the bulk freighters it was escorting would not feel like they were under military control. Rather, they just had a helpful escort along that was more or less one of them, and it was just here to help. This was especially useful in the corporate sector, or for any other regions that were proudly part of the Empire but might be sensitive about playing host to a military occupation. Unfortunately for KDY, the image of the helpful patrol boat would not be the legacy of the Nebulon B, as the ship had a remarkable habit of falling into the hands of the very insurgents it was designed to counter. In fact, the Nebulon B would be prolific in the early Rebel fleet, with one even serving as the Rebel flagship for some time. The Rebels acquired so many of these frigates through boarding actions, clandestine buys, or just out-and-out theft that the ship began to be thought of as mainly a Rebel ship, leading to some distrust when one showed up to escort an Imperial convoy. KDY still produced the vessels for the corporate sector though, and some might even say they sold the ships directly to the Rebel Alliance whenever the Imperial fleet wasn't looking. After all, KDY might have been a major Imperial supporter, but every good company knows to hedge its bets at least a little. Besides, if the Rebels don't have any ships, what need would the Empire have for more Star Destroyers? The Nebulon B was never one of Kuat's most iconic vessels, nor was it their best seller. But I include it here to show that the manufacturer was a business before all else. When the Empire fell, KDY lost most of its best contracts. There was suddenly a much smaller need for Star Destroyers and Dreadnoughts. But, thanks to the Nebulon B and the Nebulon C that came after, Kuat Drive Yards was able to continue selling warships to the chief galactic power, the newly formed New Republic. And when the Resistance formed its little fleet, a KDY Nebulon C was there to fly with it. As previously mentioned, Kuat Drive Yards made a name for itself by building dreadnoughts. And when I think dreadnought in the Star Wars galaxy, I think of this, the Executor-class Super Star Destroyer. This 20-kilometer long giant was effectively a flying Imperial city. It had a crew of nearly 300,000 Imperial Navy personnel, carried enough soldiers and war material to confidently conquer a medium-sized planet, and had enough firepower to reduce said planet's surface to molten slag via orbital bombardment. It is the definition of overkill, and the kind of power statement that only the Empire would require and that only KDY could build. Armed with nearly 2,000 heavy turbolaser batteries, 2,000 standard turbolaser batteries, 250 concussion missile tubes, 250 heavy ion cannons, and hundreds of point defense lasers, the Executor class was the most well-armed single-ship design in galactic history, at least if you don't count superweapons. They were also extremely expensive. No price estimate is known for the vessels, as they were designed in secret and only built at the Emperor's personal order, but given that they were approximately 13 times the size of an Imperial Star Destroyer, with vastly more capable weapons and power generation, it is likely that each individual Super Star Destroyer would cost upwards of 2 billion galactic credits, and quite possibly even more. The Imperial Finance Ministry likely would have keeled over at the sight of such a bill were it not for the Emperor's personal orders that these ships be built. Luckily for the bean counters and unluckily for Palpatine, only 13 of the behemoths would be completed by the time the Empire fell. These would mostly end up in the hands of Imperial warlords and be hunted down ship by the New Republic, but the legacy of fear they left behind would never fall. The Executor class is likely the most powerful and terrifying ship ever built by KDY, at least if we don't count the Eclipse. And while the Executor herself may have been built in secret over the world of Fondor, this ship is quintessentially the work of Kuat Drive Yards, and its legacy is their legacy. Kuat Drive Yards is one of the most iconic starship manufacturers of the Star Wars galaxy, and we couldn't possibly hope to cover everything they've had a hand in. For instance, while this video is primarily focused on the starships the company manufactured, it is notable to mention that KDY also developed many land vehicles, the AT-AT and AT-ST being chief amongst them. These vehicles are extremely important to the lore of the Star Wars galaxy, and they deserve more coverage, but that will have to wait for a later time. It is also worth mentioning that Kuat Drive Yards is the parent company of one Rothana Heavy Engineering, a giant in its own right, and one that will require more extensive coverage. If you like the Clone Army and all of its gear, then that episode will be of particular interest to you once we get to it. There are many more companies we still have to cover, and many more topics that we have to discuss. To catch those videos and help us make more, be sure to like and subscribe and all that other YouTube stuff. Until that time though, I have been Austin, and this has been College of Lore. Thank you for watching.